Hi and welcome to today's webinar. My name's Rebecca and I'm part of the team here at Egress and I'll be hosting today's session. I'm joined by Lisa Forte, partner at Red Goat Cybersecurity, and Egress's CEO, Tony Pepper. We're delighted that so many of you have registered and are attending today. If you have any questions throughout the session, you should be able to see a Q&A option within your webinar console. Please do use that. We will be leaving a little bit of time at the end of the session to go through as many questions as we can. So our subject today is looking at the topic of insider data breaches. And as I've already mentioned, I'm joined by Lisa. Lisa will be spending some time exploring why these incidents happen. Now, I think we often talk about insider data breaches, and we may say something like, oh, that person put data at risk because they were rushing and they sent an email to the wrong person. And we kind of chalk that up as the cause of the data breach. Now, often, we tend to find that actually the real reason, the real cause is a lot deeper, and it lies within their behaviors and within the psychology of what's going on with that individual person at that point in time. So Lisa's going to dig into that for us and look at some of the profiles of likely data breach personas. Tony is then going to present to us looking at the most common vector for insider data breaches, and that's email. Tony is going to be examining what advances in technology can do to help respond to this challenge as people's behavior changes and kind of dynamically enable technology to prevent data breaches and keep data safe. And as mentioned already, we'll have that Q&A session at the end, so please do use the console to submit your questions. One thing we're also going to do as part of today's webinar is conduct a few anonymous polls. That's going to give us a few talking points for later, which will start the Q&A session with. Now, we're going to run two polls. The first I'm going to launch in just a second, and then the second one will be part of Lisa's presentation. And as mentioned, these are anonymous, so I would encourage you to take part in that and give us the data to kind of help launch that discussion later. So for our first question, which should be live on your screen right now, it's looking at whether in the last 12 months, the types of potential email data breaches that have occurred that have been reported to you. So if you would like to submit your answers, that would be brilliant. And I'll give you just a couple of minutes or 30 seconds to sort of do that. I can see that the answers are coming in now, which is brilliant. Thank you. I am just going to pass over to Lisa now, who's going to look into the psychology for us. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, Lisa. So I'll just give you control now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks very much for the introduction. I'm going to focus on the psychology behind the breaches and hopefully give you a little bit of an insight into the types of personalities and the types of mistakes and the types of actions that can lead to data breaches. So I think the first thing to really understand is overall in society, we kind of misunderstand insiders a little bit, to be honest. So generally speaking, when we look at what the scientific community has discovered from a psychological perspective, and we look at what the legal community know from a sort of culpability in the legal sphere, we sort of have four categories, really. We have purely accidental incidents, things that are completely accidental mistakes, you know, no level of culpability attaches to them. We then have negligence, where it's a bit more culpability, recklessness, where it's a little bit more again, and finally intent, where the person actually deliberately goes to attack your organization. So I'm going to look at them in a little bit more detail because it's actually quite important for the rest of my talk to understand the differences between these last three. If we look at negligence, recklessness, and intent, they are a little bit different. So the thing to understand about negligence is that your employee, at the time that they did the thing that they did, the action, say clicking on a phishing link or putting data onto an unencrypted USB, they didn't know they were taking a security risk. They thought it was fine, but they should have known that they were taking a risk. So this might be people who perhaps didn't do the mandatory training that they should have done. Maybe they were overconfident. Maybe you sent out awareness messages of something to be aware of that they ignored. They should have known it was a risk, but at the time they didn't. So that's negligence. What's the next category, which is a little bit more culpable again, in terms of responsibility, is recklessness. And these are people who, at the time that they did the action that led to the breach, they knew they were taking a risk. Now, they didn't intend to cause harm to your organization. It wasn't the purpose of what they were doing, but they thought the risk was worthwhile taking. So maybe they thought, you know what, actually, it's just faster. It's just faster if I don't put it on an encrypted USB stick. So I'm just going to do it. I know I shouldn't. I know I'm taking a risk, but I'm just going to take that risk that it will be fine. And that's the recklessness category. The final category, which is more culpable again, is intent. And these are people who deliberately take data or compromise security, either from the perspective of taking data for themselves to move on to another employer, or deliberately sabotaging your IT systems because of revenge or being a disgruntled employee. So the key here is that actually there is a level of culpability that changes between each of these characters, which I'm going to explain in a bit more detail. So the first person that I want to talk about is Keen Catherine. We've probably all met a Keen Catherine. At some points in my career, I've probably been described as a Keen Catherine, to be perfectly honest. She's someone who is very loyal, very motivated, probably has a lot of energy, new and keen to the company, really focused on doing well in the company, wanting promotion, that kind of thing. And the problem here is that there's probably a lot of drive and focus, and a lot of focus on productivity and getting things done. And as you'll probably know, that kind of comes with a cost of security. So her level of awareness might be quite low. She might make a lot of mistakes with security. Despite the fact that she's a well-meaning individual, she may make those mistakes. Next, and I'm sure we can definitely all relate to this individual, Tired Tim, who I'm sure we've all felt like at some point in our lives. I actually worked on a case that involved a Tired Tim in another organization. And in this case, he was this exceedingly busy guy. He had 2 young kids. He just moved house. His mother had been taken ill or something. And there was all these sort of family stresses that were going on in his life. And he was sort of getting behind with his workload, doing additional hours, things like that. And when we looked into it and we interviewed some of the colleagues, they said, that he was this sort of caffeine-fueled person who was always sort of running late because he had a million things to do. And the problem was he kept, forgetting or ignoring the reminders to do the mandatory training because he had so much on his plate. He thought, this is just 20 minutes that I can't afford to lose on doing this training. Now, in this particular case, on a Friday afternoon, quite late, the gentleman received an email from HMRC, and it said that there was an urgent update that needed to be done with his tax code. He clicks on the link and he enters all the details, and obviously this was a phishing email. Now, what was kind of sort of notable about this case, I suppose, was that 2 days beforehand, the IT security team had sent a reminder message round about this very type of email that they'd seen, and they'd sent it to all the staff. But because Tim was so busy, he just forwarded it into the deletion folder, and that was the end of that. He never read it. So Tim was negligent because actually at the time when he entered all of that detail into that phishing email, he didn't know really what he was doing was a risk. He thought it was probably fine and it was HMRC. However, he should have known because his IT team had sent an email round about it. So this is an example of negligence. Next, we have reckless Raj. And Raj is still falls short of intent. He's not intending to harm the company. That's definitely not what's going on, but he is a risk taker. And I worked on a case that involved a reckless Raj. And I'm sure we've all met somebody in our jobs who cuts corners and ignores the rules to get things done quicker. And this gentleman employed a sort of laissez-faire attitude to policies and procedures that the company had put in place. And he was just one of these people who just wanted to get things done really quickly and move on. And he just wasn't kind of focused and calm and thinking things through. So he used to cut a lot of corners. And on this particular breach, what transpired to have happened was he decided to take a load of reports, put them onto a USB stick and take them home, because it was easier for him to upload these reports onto his own Google Drive and then send that out to all the people that needed to receive it than it was to encrypt it and go through the whole laborious process that his company had set up. So he knew this was faster. So the thing to recognize here is that he thought, you know what, I know there's a risk. I know that if I take this data, there is a risk that there will be a breach. There is a risk I'll harm my company. But I think that risk is so low that it's worth my while to do because it saves me so much time. And this is what recklessness is and how it plays out. The final one, and perhaps the one that we usually associate with the word insider, is intent. And I've done a lot of work on intentional insiders and the issues that they bring to companies and everything. And this is Sneaky Sarah. And she is planning on moving companies. She's planning on changing careers completely. So she's thinking, okay, in a sort of strategic move, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start forwarding the client lists of this company to myself because they might come in useful when I move jobs. So that's what I'm going to do. So she starts to forward the client lists to herself. Now, obviously, at this point, she knows she's not supposed to do that. And she is intentionally taking that data and sending it to herself for a reason that she shouldn't be doing. So we see this a lot, and we also see a lot of sabotage going on with intentional insiders. And these are people who really are putting their sort of future careers first, and they're very, very difficult to deal with. In a piece of research we did into intentional insiders, we had a gentleman called Rob who worked for a big multinational, and he was approached by a competitor of this multinational, and they said to him, we can offer you £20,000 more a year and a £10,000 golden hello if you just bring your client lists with you. And he said to me, I seriously considered it because I thought, well, you know, my company's probably doing the same to their staff and I've been turned down for a promotion. So, you know, I'm a bit irritated by that. And he went back and forth on it for ages because he was genuinely considering taking this offer. And he never reported it to his employer, actually, despite the fact he claimed to me he didn't take it. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I'll let you make up your own mind about that. But the fact of the matter is that this does happen. And if you're offered this much money, it's definitely tempting to a lot of staff who maybe are a bit irritated at the moment with their job. So that's sort of the characters, but why does it really work? What's the sort of psychology behind it? Well, one of the main pieces of psychology that we need to look to is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And this tells us that people who don't know very much about something totally overestimate how much they know. And you have probably come across these people, probably on LinkedIn, where you've seen people who claim they know everything about everything. And the problem with this is that you do a little bit of training with your staff and they think they know everything there is to know about cybersecurity. And so they think they can judge risk, but they can't judge risk because they don't know that much. I think one of the best ways to explain this is imagine you and I are stood on a beach and we're looking out at sea and you are a very, very accomplished open water swimmer, okay? You're very, very experienced, very good, strong swimmer. However, I can't really swim at all. So we're looking out at the sea and we see this island and we think, okay, let's swim to that island. Now, I'm looking at it with no experience whatsoever and thinking, doesn't look that far away. How bad can that be? I can probably swim that. And you're looking at it as a very experienced swimmer thinking, well, I've done that lots of times, so she'll probably be fine. So off we go into the water and I drown. And that's essentially what's happening in companies. So when we talk about this sort of thing, and your staff are thinking they know everything there is to know about risk and cybersecurity, and your IT team who have loads of knowledge over here think there's no way they can't know all of this. And the two things collide and you have a disaster. So the way you kind of defend against the Dunning-Kruger effect is by sort of making it a lot more specific. So if I said to you, oh, well, the next poll, we are going to say to you, you know, how good do you think you are at DIY? I reckon most of you are going to think, yeah, I can remember a time I painted that room. Yeah, I'm probably pretty decent at DIY. And you'll rate yourself quite high. However, if I said to you, how good do you think you are at using a pneumatic drill? Some of you, most of you, will probably not recall an instance where you've ever used that tool before in your life. So you're going to say, well, I probably don't know anything about it. So this is how we kind of deal with the Dunning-Kruger effect. So the next one that we want to talk about is cognitive dissonance. And this is where we know we are supposed to do one thing, but we want to do another thing. Now, one of my friends is a smoker, and I said to her, you know, surely you know the studies about smoking and, you know, the sort of the dangers of it. And she's an asthmatic as well. And she said, yeah, no, I know all of it, but the problem is I love smoking. So I want to carry on doing it. And this is the problem that we have with cognitive dissonance, because it actually makes us so uncomfortable that we know we're supposed to encrypt this email. But what we actually really want to do is to do our jobs quickly, and it's more convenient. And, you know, so we'll start making excuses and we'll start saying, okay, well, everybody else doesn't encrypt it and everyone else puts it on a USB stick and takes it home. So it's probably okay for me to do it as well, even though I know I'm not supposed to do it. Then we have social proof. So social proof is where we sort of follow the herd. So one of the best ways of explaining this, you've probably all got off a train before at a station and you don't really know where the exit is. So you get off the train and everybody else walks left. Even if you haven't seen the sign that says exit, the chances are you're walking left with everybody else. And we do this because when we're uncertain as to what we're supposed to do, we follow the herd. So why is this important for cybersecurity? Well, this really, really depends on your culture in your organization. Because if you have a culture where people cut corners and that's okay, what you'll find is that you'll bring in new staff, they'll see that culture, they will follow the rest of the herd and do the exact same thing. So you have to really look at how much, what we call decision latitude, how much freedom you're giving your employees to make these decisions about how they conduct themselves and what they do and whether or not they cut corners. So that all sounds pretty scary and horrible, but there are things we can do to reduce the effect of some of these things and certainly make ourselves more secure. The first thing is training, and I know everyone says training, but this is especially important for your high-risk staff. So having mandatory training for everyone is brilliant, but for your high-risk staff, so the people that handle the really good data, the finances, the HR, the people who have the personal data, it's really important that you invest in some good training for these people, because they're the people who hold the keys to the crown jewels. So it's totally worth investing in some really good training. But as we know, human beings, unfortunately, we're running on slightly defective hardware. And so we are subject to biases and problems. So, you know, we need a mix of all these different controls. We need email defenses that can detect abnormal behavior, spot mistakes, spot the fact that someone's sending a document that they shouldn't be sending. We need to take some of this out of the hands of the employees and remind them. We need to also run things like crisis simulations. So if this does happen, if the worst case scenario comes to being, what will your company do? How will you handle that? How will you handle the communications to the public and to your customers? All of these things are really important. And document classification. So I used to work in the police, and I've been in the police a long, long time, and everything was protectively marked. Literally everything was protectively marked. So you knew that you could print that document, but you couldn't print this document, and you couldn't email this document. And when I came into the private sector, it actually shocked me at how little protective marking was used generally. And this has two benefits, really. If you mark special documents as, secret or whatever, tool you're using, TLP, readings, whatever, then it helps your staff know what they can and can't do with it. So they can instantly know, oh, I can't print that because it's marked as this. But it also means that you can employ email defenses that say, well, actually, you're trying to email a document that's marked in this way, and you can't do that. Or you can't send that to a Gmail account. And I think this is something that we really have to get better at in the private sector and automate as much as we can. The final thing is no fault reporting. If someone makes a mistake, if someone spots someone else making a mistake, it's really, really important that we don't punish people. I had one client who was saying that their phishing detection was really, really good. And he was saying, oh, we're getting nobody reporting that they've clicked on phishing links. And I thought, okay, that's pretty good. It transpired that what was actually happening in the company was that they would run a phishing test. And everybody who clicked on that phishing link or phishing email would be put forward when they reported it in a company-wide memo that named every single person that had clicked on a phishing link that month. So what was actually happening was not that his employees were becoming more aware of phishing, it was that they were thinking, oh, I can't report it because otherwise I'm going to be named and shamed. So by going too hard on your employees, all you're actually doing is stopping them actually reporting it at all. So I'm going to leave you with a quote, which was from one of my participants in my study. And they said, it really isn't an insider threat thing, but I've taken reports and projects I've worked on when I've moved companies. They're part mine, really, and everyone does it. So I think it's expected. And I think this is the problem we have. We have this issue where people think that the things that they have worked on are part theirs and that they can take them with them when they leave because they part own them. But certainly in the UK, the default position from a legal perspective is that everything you do during work hours is owned by your employer. It's not owned by you. And so it needs to stay with your employer when you leave. So I think we have to just be aware that employees do start to think like this. And I read a statistic that actually said that the United Kingdom had the worst rate of that type of data theft in the world. And I think it's partly because we move jobs quite frequently. So it's definitely something that I think you need to be aware of and sort of reiterate to your staff that actually, this work is not part owned by you, and these projects have to stay here when you leave. So I think we're going to do another poll now. If you have any questions, please reach out to me on Twitter or online. And there's the Insider Threat Report that I've put the link on. So we have this poll, which I think Rebecca is going to introduce to you all.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lisa. And wonderful to see you bring those personas to life for us. As some of you are already voting, our second poll is looking at those 4 individuals that Lisa illustrated to us and asking which one is most likely in your organization to cause a data breach. As mentioned earlier, again, the results are anonymous, but it will just help us with a little bit of discussion later for our Q&A session. I'm going to pass over to Tony now, looking at the role of technology to prevent insider data breaches.
Right, thanks, Bex. And Lisa, thank you so much for that insightful walkthrough of the getting inside I think the minds and the psychology of people I think we meet and socialize with and are friends with on a daily basis. I think our business is better off and more informed, unquestionably, since we've been working much closer with Lisa, because I think as a technology business working in cybersecurity, we always believe we are trying to tackle real world problems, but actually it's only when you really get inside the mind of people inside a business do you really understand where the real problems are, right? So what I'm going to just touch on is where technology can play a vital role. And I think it's important to note that that training is still a really key part of every one of our businesses, ensuring that everyone in the organization is certainly benchmarked to a level of understanding. And I think Lisa quite rightly said that even when you deliver training, the reality about training is, there are many employees, many people that slip through the gaps, either knowingly or unknowingly, right? So I think what we firmly believe and passionately believe is that technology, there's such a powerful role for technology to play to augment training. And I think the reason we feel that's really important is because, unlike many training, which is typically carried out over a period of time, typically in series, we feel that technology has a role to play in a constant manner, whereby something that is always a layer of protection wrapped around people in business, constantly and where appropriately interacting with that person, helping them to avoid mistakes, or perhaps guiding that person when they're about to do something that perhaps they shouldn't really do. So I think it's so important that these two things are kind of pulled together. I think the one thing I would say is, the world is a completely different place now. I mean, I find this an incredible opportunity to be on a webinar launching these kind of things. But actually, the world 10 years ago feels like an even more completely different place. And quite frankly, the underlying technology to deliver the type of proactive protection that allows us to do these kind of things just weren't simply available 10 years ago. Hell, they weren't even available 5 years ago. But in that, what feels like relative short space of time, so much has moved on. And as a result, using the latest in technology, and I think a lot of people are a little bit tired now of the phrase machine learning and AI, but I think the reality is, the advances in technology and the advances of machine learning and artificial intelligence have given technology companies like Egress such a phenomenal opportunity to build on that technology stack and allow us to deliver against use cases that would otherwise simply not be possible 5 and certainly 10 years ago. So that's why technology is in itself is in such an exciting space right now. But I think the key about machine learning and AI, it's become a little bit of a sort of a black box capability that people talk about. It's hard to really get your arms around machine learning, but how we think of it is talk less so about the machine learning itself and the sophistication of it, but more around what's the business problems that this is solving today. So let me just touch on a few of those business problems. Well, first of all, Lisa quite rightly said, when we're talking about insider threat, when we look at that landscape, insider threat in today's environment is a myriad of different things. And insider threat it comes from a lot of different vehicles and different mechanisms, different channels, if you like. We feel that certainly email is one of the most exposed channel for the insider threat, and I think Lisa's touched on several of those, but that's simply because it is a tunnel directly into your business. And actually, as a result, it is also the easiest way and the riskiest component to your business. It's easy for our employees, for us, to be able to communicate content to internal or external suppliers or employees. It's just so easy, but it's also so easy to make a mistake. And I think what's also quite interesting, over the past 10 years, while email was the first to enable, really an enabling technology to allow us to be able to communicate, I think many businesses have spent the last 10 to 15 years trying to really secure email. And I mean at the edge. So I've described it as overlay services. So they could include boundary-based technology. That could be inbound content inspection. That could be DLP, either sometimes delivered at the desktop, often at the edge, to see what information is leaving the business. And also, let's layer on top of that a capability to protect the message in an email using encryption. So for years, businesses have been trying to overlay and layer on top of rudimentary mail services to protect our businesses, to protect our people, and to protect our data. The sad reality is that they don't really work. And I think that's the place we find ourselves. We find this tunnel right into our business, which is ultimately a productivity tool, is now our biggest threat. And it's for those reasons why we focused our entire attention on trying to overlay much more intelligent security services into email to try and tackle some of these problems. We feel because it's a completely new space and it's a completely new way of tackling what is a very, very old problem. It needs a completely new category of product to do that. We're calling it human layer security because in today's world, I think one of the things that I got from Lisa's presentation is this is such a complex problem. This isn't just a simple rule-based approach will solve this. This is super complex. This is different personalities with different agendas, some of which are malicious, some of which are unintentioned. But the reality is it's a very complex problem in a world where we are incredibly busy and are ultimately conflicted between making sure we get the job done in the fastest possible time, but also trying to do the right thing and secure our clients' information. And I think ultimately, I think the world is just, it's a tussle, it's a tug of war between productivity and security. And I think the reality is it shouldn't need to be like that. So we are part of a new era of technology that ultimately focuses entirely around human behavior and looks for anomalies in that behavior. Why that's so important is because if we're able to detect anomalies based on your past behavior, then actually it can be, there's two real benefits that we can pick up from that. The first piece is we don't need to manage it. Unlike legacy tools, I mentioned DLP previously, a lot of the businesses on this call may have DLP, but they won't work because they're not sophisticated enough. DLP relies on fundamental rules that either allows or doesn't allow information to freely flow in and outside the business. What it does not do is actually have the intelligence or the sophistication to say, now this information can leave, but do you really mean it to send to this Lisa? When normally you typically send that information to a different Lisa. It needs to be so much more complex. And actually, again, when we're emailing 4, 5, 10 different recipients on an email thread, and we are tired Tim that we referenced, when you are up against a tight deadline and you're authoring a message and you enter the wrong Tim, you simply won't spot that. And no technology on the market up until now will actually proactively detect that. And I think I'm going to come on to shortly the real impact that has on businesses, but more importantly, how undiscovered this is. So I think for us, we see anomaly detection as the only way to really capture human-led mistakes. And again, I loved that in Lisa's presentation, she talked about sneaky Sarah. And actually something that she said is, look, inside a threat is very typically associated to sneaky Sarah, very typically associated to the intent-based attack. And actually they are complex and hard to solve. Whereas in reality, reckless Raj, tired Tim, keen Catherine, these are more human-led errors that probably every single person on this call has done themselves. These are daily incidents that are happening in the business and therefore are a significantly higher risk to the business. I think equally, I think it isn't just about making mistakes. I think one of the areas that certainly I want to cover is protecting content. I think when we released our first message encryption capability about 7 or 8 years ago now, the market really didn't adopt protection of content at all. And actually, simply because of the kickback that typically the recipient experienced, that the friction, if you like, that inherently brings. So I think everyone on this call, and maybe a lot of the people we relate to, there is times where the negligent individual, we can all sympathize to some extent as to if the technology team has given the business a tool to protect content that inherently introduces barriers and friction and delay. I'm not for a second suggesting it's right, but it's very real to actually at least relate and empathize to the mental struggle that that individual will go through, knowing full well the typical kickback that person would have to go through, and the deadline that they're about to miss, and the flack that they'll get once that happens, that is negligent. That person known full well that the content was sensitive and they should have protected it, but they chose not to because of friction. They chose not to because typically the tools that we give our end users are just hard work. And it doesn't need to be hard work, but a lot of the legacy tools out in the market are. So I think we have to actually adopt a completely new way of protecting content, lowering friction, and a completely new way of understanding when a risk realizes itself through anomaly detection. So for me, I want to end with this one slide, which is the tip of the iceberg. We spend so much time in this space. We obsess about intelligent email security, and we talk to hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations about this issue. And what's fascinating, the amount of talks that I do and Lisa does around the world, when we talk about who has ever received an email that wasn't meant to be sent to them, almost everyone puts their hand up. In this day and age, I think people are quite happy to admit that they themselves have made a mistake. And yet, when you actually go to the risk log within your business and say, can we explore and examine the number of incidents that we have logged internally as a misdirected email? Let me tell you, you won't find many. You might find a handful. And that's not because it's not happening. That's because people are not hand raising. The reality of this issue is simply this. Technology cannot detect to date and prevent this from happening. So if I don't know I've made a mistake, and the person I've sent it to accidentally doesn't tell me that I've made a mistake, how on earth am I meant to hand raise? If I don't know what I don't know, I can't possibly hand raise. And that's the first issue. The second issue is probably the second most common. That email that sends that shiver down your spine, which is I've sent an email to the wrong Lisa, and I get that email land back in my inbox, which with a subject line of, was this meant for me? That moment where you think, and then that second moment where you think, who am I going to tell about this? And will they ever know if we just forget about it? Those incidents are happening every single day, and we're merely walking a tightrope every single day of these incidents happening. So you won't find them on the risk log. Well, how can CISOs, CIOs, risk, privacy individuals, how can we possibly talk to the business about something we can't possibly see with our own eyes? And it's difficult. And this is why it's part of a thought leadership exercise that we're all educating the world. If we know instinctively it happens, how do we try and elevate the bar? Well, I thought what Lisa said was absolutely on the money. No fault reporting is part of that story. We have to introduce a no fault reporting culture so we can actually see those hand raisers actually start to say, look, I've made a mistake. It wasn't intentional. It was unintentional, but it needs to, and I think what you'll see over time, you'll see that increase. And most importantly, technology available that can detect and can proactively stop this from happening. So I think in our world, we are in a completely new era of technology that can capture some of these incidents. And we are in a completely new era of regulatory compliance and fines that actually can really damage our businesses if we don't take this seriously. We look forward to engaging with everyone in this space and introducing how we can help tackle some of these issues, and look forward to any Q&A that might follow. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tony. Really good to hear about the powerful role that technology can play in spotting anomalies and mitigating this risk. So as mentioned kind of at the start of the webinar, we've got some time now for questions. Please do use the Q&A option within the console to type out any questions, and we'll make our way through as many of those as the time allows. But initially, and as we've discussed throughout the webinar, we've got the results from our polls back. I'm not sure if it's possible for our webinar host to share those results with the wider audience, but looking initially at the first question around in the last 12 months, has data at your organisation been put at risk due to, and then we gave 6 options. Oh, there we go, lovely. Now, by far and away, the top cause there is emailing the wrong person. So sort of 2/3 of people have said that has happened in their organisation. Lisa, I'd like to pass to you first and just ask you, kind of, is that, I know obviously Tony's talked about it, and email is obviously our world as Egress, but is this what you see as well in clients, particularly over something kind of like phishing, given how much news coverage issues like spear phishing and phishing emails generally get?
Yeah, I mean, I would say my guess would have been that it would be emailing the wrong person and clicking a phishing link, just because, you know, say for example, actually a few weeks ago, I received an email from a law firm that included basically this entire detailed divorce proceedings document that was sent to me. Now, obviously, this came as a little bit of a shock to me. And I thought, oh God, what's going on here? It transpired that they had a client who was called Lisa something very similar, and they'd emailed me from other conversations we'd had, and I was absolutely shocked by this. And obviously it had a lot of very personal information. So I think you're spot on, Tony, when you say it is so easy to do, and when you're in a rush, or you're working on your phone as you're traveling and commuting, it's such an easy mistake to make, but can cause such a huge problem. So it's sort of the easiest one to do, and probably yielding very bad consequences. But similarly with phishing, it's not that difficult to write a very convincing spear phishing email now from a little bit of OSINT, a little bit of reconnaissance done on social media. And suddenly, you're from the BMW dealership that you're looking at a car to buy or something. So it makes it all a lot more likely that staff make mistakes. And it's not deliberate and it's not malicious necessarily, but the ultimate effect of that could be the same.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And Tony, do you have anything else that you'd like to add above and beyond about these results?
I think just one thing really, which is I think in particular in all areas, I think our customer supply chain is becoming wise to this. And what I'm seeing a real trend now, in particular in the legal sector actually, and accountancy sector in particular, is actually clients really bestowing upon law firms now, what are you doing to prevent this from happening? They're actually saying, as your client, what technical controls, I think the key there is what technical controls have you got in place to prevent exactly that from happening? And I think there's an enormous amount of pressure now that's being put on firms, accountancy, legal, and indeed all customers that handle and process sensitive data. We're all being asked, what are you doing to prevent that happening? Because it's my data. Ultimately, I'm the data controller. And ultimately, I need you to apply appropriate protection. So what technical measures you've got in place? So I think that's driving lots of questions internally. And I think what I'm also seeing is some of those clients are actually kind of solutionizing the problem. So some of those clients are even saying, what DLP rules have you got in place to stop this happening? And of course, firms are sort of saying, well, DLP rules isn't going to solve this problem. So I think we've got to get on the front foot and solve it in our own way. I think businesses have got to say, look, if the business problem is, how do I prevent our employees from sharing content to the wrong individual, then let us solve that and ensure that we're looking after your data. I think the only one other point I'd make is the 15% of the audience that says no incidents reported. And I think that's sort of evidence to my last point, which is, I think what's really interesting is if you actually did a straw poll in those businesses, 15%, 28 out of almost 200, if they actually ask themselves, have I ever received an email that was sent accidentally to me, or have I ever done it? They might say, well, actually, I have. Or actually, if we did a straw poll of individuals and asked them the question, I don't suspect, there might have been no incidents formally reported, but is it happening? I suspect it is happening. And I think that's where we've got to get a bit better, actually, I think.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things, misdirected emails can happen in a heartbeat, but then the remediation effort, much as Lisa said, explaining to that client why their private details have gone over to someone else, that takes a long time to kind of remediate. And it's something that you've touched on in both of your presentations, is this idea of reporting. And in our second poll, which hopefully the results will be viewable on the screen, but Tired Tim came out on top with I think 41% of the votes there, quickly followed by Reckless Raj. Now, no fault reporting is something that I know, Lisa, you feel very passionately about. Are there kind of logical steps or good tactics that you've seen in other organizations that people can implement to help support a culture of openness?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult, and it very much depends from company to company. But I do think that you have to be really careful with training as well, because sometimes I've seen companies who have had a member of staff who have clicked on a phishing link, say in a phishing test, and they're immediately hit with this pretty terrible online training. And it comes across as a punishment. And although you're not saying you've done this horrible thing and I'm going to humiliate you, you are then saying, well, actually, you need to sit through this terrible online training, which ends up being a bit of a punishment. So I think you need to also reward them for reporting, because actually, with a perfect security behavior, what we want is two things. We don't want them to click on the phishing email or send the email to the wrong person. But then we also want them to report that they've received a phishing email. So there's a two-pronged thing here for the behavior. So if they've done 50% of it by reporting to you, then I actually think you need to say, well done for reporting, that was excellent. Because actually it's much better, even if they've behaved in a way that was perhaps negligent, much better that you know that, than, as Tony said, people just hiding it from you and you have no idea for 13 odd months until it's too late.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lisa. And Tony, anything you want to add to that around the different personas and who's come out on top there?
Look, I just think, when I see these results, they make perfect sense to me, because I think cybersecurity, and in particular the insider threat, your instinct is to look to Sneaky Sarah, isn't it? I mean, that's what people think, like Sneaky Sarah, that's the one that's doing it. I knew it. I can even see it in her eyes. But actually, in reality, King Catherine, Tired Tim, and Records, they're just normal people. They're just normal people. You sit next to a Tired Tim every day. And actually, this is why these results are so accurate to as this straw poll to every formal poll and formal survey that we launch, which is actually people are busy. People also feel like they don't want to put barriers up in front of customers. It's not always an intentional breach to put the company at harm. It's ultimately, these people feel like they're doing the job. And I bet Tired Tim, if you met Tired Tim down the local bar, and having a drink, they'd be saying, look, my company absolutely loved me for working so hard, and actually I'm working all hours and I'm so exhausted, and if only they'd hire more. But actually he probably feels like he's doing them a disservice, and yeah, he's clearly putting the business at risk. I just think there's really such an issue there that ultimately, I think for me, these polls are so interesting, because we have to look at our people differently. We have to put special intelligent technology around them that can guide these people as opposed to kind of punish them.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. And so kind of moving on to a few of the questions submitted via our audience. One person has asked that when companies impose excessive security that goes kind of above and beyond what is required by the company or by the data, and it ultimately stops people doing their jobs effectively, does that not encourage recklessness? Lisa, can I pass this to you first, just to talk about that behavior? And then Tony, I'd be really interested to get your take on how technology can be used to kind of appropriately scale security. So Lisa, if you could share some insights.
Yeah, I think actually whoever asked the question, yeah, you're right, basically. There's something that we call decision latitude, which is essentially how much freedom you give your employees to decide how it is they do their job and conduct their job. Now, if you give someone a lot of decision latitude, you've given them loads of freedom to maybe use their own Google Docs, to use whatever apps they want to use. And obviously that's not great for security because it's a bit of a free-for-all. However, if you have sort of a very low level of decision latitude, i.e. you're overly restrictive on what they can do and how they can do it, you also get that cutting corners, you get that recklessness. Because what you've done is you've made it so hard for employees to be productive and to get things done that they'll end up cutting corners in order to do that. So it's really important that when you employ security, that it has to remember that the first and foremost, it's supporting business functions. It's not there to sort of be fun and restrict everyone's lifestyle. It's there to help you do your job properly. And I think if you're implementing anything that doesn't do that, you're making a really serious mistake in your organization.
I'd agree with that, actually, Lisa. And you know what? I'll share a memory of mine, and I'm gonna take you back to 2002 to 2003. So long enough, hopefully, I won't get into too much trouble for kind of sharing it. So in a previous world, in a previous business, we used to work extensively with UK MOD. So again, the defence space, and there was obviously appetite to ensure a very, very high degree of protection over content. And for one particular situation in relation to logging into laptops, they had a mandatory standard, which was to use Clearview FireGuard passwords, which was 2 randomly generated passwords, which the user couldn't pick. It was randomly generated, then they had to remember two randomly generated passwords, might add, and in order to be able to log into the laptop. And I remember visiting one sort of defense base after the another, and every single base I went to and every single laptop I saw, what do you think I saw underneath the laptop on a post-it note? That's right, Lisa. It was the 2 passwords, right? Because no one could remember the things. And I think this is where appropriate security comes in. I think, thankfully, those days are behind us. And I think if you look at the government agencies' approach to risk and security, we have come a long, long way. And there's much more sensitivity around that balance between risk and productivity. I think really whoever asked that question, I think it's absolutely legitimate. It's all about appropriate levels of security and the moment whereby appropriate to the content and appropriate to the risk. Now, when you look at through the lens of appropriate to the content and appropriate to the level of risk, then that should dictate the level of security, not a kind of one size fits all across the board.
Brilliant, thank you. And another question, kind of, I'm conscious that we are coming up to time, but hopefully we can sneak in a couple more questions from our audience. So it's a question that's specifically directed at Lisa, but obviously, Tony, if you have any insights to share, I'd be keen to hear them. The question is, what is your view on how to handle repeat offenders for phishing simulations? This person has given extra phishing training to repeat offenders, including one-on-one, but only by making a list public did they actually see any decline in the behavior. Is there any insight that you could kind of bring to that from your experience? Because I know you've told me stories before of almost the opposite happening, that publishing the list has been more detrimental than helpful. So is there anything you can share there for repeat offenders?
I think there's 2 things here, really. I think the first thing is that you have to maybe look at some of the training and have a conversation with this individual. I'm also a big believer, and this is something the police used to do really, really well, actually making security part of your employment review. So talking about how you've engaged with security or issues that you're having when you're having your, I don't know, each company do it differently. Police used to do it every 6 months to do a review of your performance, and security used to be part of that. So it was instantly linked to your job, your promotional activities, your promotional opportunities, shall we say. And your career progression was obviously affected by it. So that's the first thing that you can try. The other thing that I think is really important with phishing simulations is that I had one client who said, our staff are amazing at phishing simulations. They are brilliant. They spot them every time. No one clicks on any links. And I thought, oh, wow, that's amazing. I haven't seen any company that's had this before. So I go through and I look at the emails that they've been sending out. And every single email was eBay. It was a fake eBay. Don't click this link for this, click this link for this. So what had happened was their staff were absolutely amazing, maybe unparalleled at detecting eBay phishing emails. But as soon as you sent them anything else, then straight away they failed for it. So you want to make sure in your phishing simulations that you're trialing lots of different types of email to make sure that the staff are actually recognizing lots of different types of phishing email. So you might want to see if maybe they're falling for specific types of email as opposed to more generally as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, that's a really interesting point about the different types of emails and what someone may kind of fall for along that spectrum. Tony, I know obviously the question was more behavioural based and towards Lisa, but is there anything you would like to add to that one?
I think Lisa's absolutely dead right. And I think the only thing naturally I would couple on that is technology, right? Technology that prevents and stops and blocks, because obviously again, but I think that training layer and that varied simulation is absolutely critical. Especially the variety point, I think is absolutely on the money. But I think technology, I think invest in technology that can ultimately capture those issues at the point where the person's at most at risk. So I think technology layered with training.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm going to be cheeky and I'm going to sneak in one more question, just because it's so topical, and then we'll wrap this up. But someone has asked, do you think that people implement different security practices at home versus the work environment? And obviously, considering that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, so many of us are now working remotely. What are the implications of this? Tony, if I pass this one over to you first, and then we'll come to Lisa.
Sure. Look, welcome to my world, everybody. Okay, my new world in COVID-19. I live and breathe in two applications. The first is this video conferencing session. I feel like I'm living in a Zoom, in our case, world. But the second application I live and breathe in is email. And the reality is I'm probably sending more and email and receiving more and being more proactive on email than I've ever been. Oddly enough, when in a sort of more normalized environment, I'd probably send 50% of my communication from my phone, whereas now it's probably 90% via my laptop in this case. So look, the reality is a remote working posture is different, and therefore the security constraints are different. And actually, bear in mind, we've talked about email as the biggest risk. I think sadly, which is quite horrific to even think of, but even in times such as COVID-19, I think ultimately hackers are taking advantage of that, and ultimately knowing that the security posture have cracks appearing, because very few businesses have in their BCP have planned for every single individual in the entire organization working remotely, and therefore there's an opportunity for hackers to attack more. And there's your phishing challenge. And I think equally people are in unfamiliar territory. And when you're in unfamiliar territory, you can make more mistakes. So I think we see it as more concerning generally, which is why ultimately I think businesses need to be sort of extra vigilant and perhaps more careful at these times.
Brilliant, thank you. And Lisa, the same question for you around security whilst working remotely.
I think that we're a lot more vulnerable, especially to social engineering. If you imagine, when you're at work, you're in this like perfect environment where you're in your cubicle, it's quiet, you've got, everything's all set up, and you've got your little routine. Now, take that, plunk you at home, the kids are running around and screaming, the dog's just knocked something over, everything's sort of semi-chaotic, and you're all disrupted because you can't go out and all the horrible things that come with this. You're not in that focused state. I mean, I know personally, I've definitely felt distracted. I felt, like I don't know whether I'm coming and going some days. So then if you receive a phishing email and it's fairly cleverly written, I think you're way more likely to fall for that email, your staff, because, you're on your own, you're trying to do a million things at once, make the dinner, and then you get an email, and it's all kind of set up really in favor of the attackers. And also, you've got to remember that it's, there's lots of different ways that attackers can use. And, you know, unfortunately, they tend to use crises like this as a way of getting in. And so you see World Health Organization phishing emails, you see NHS appearing phishing emails, and they play on that fear and that panic that we're all sort of in, that's being reinforced by the media. And unfortunately, all the focus, as Tony says, has been, right, okay, we've got to keep the business moving. Everyone's now work from home. How are we going to manage this? But we can't forget that security still has to be up there as important, because if we let the ball drop on this a little bit, we are going to end up in a really serious situation. And you see this a lot with all sorts of companies, but we're all more vulnerable at this moment in time. So it's really, really important that you don't let the ball drop and you don't think, okay, well, I'll wait for things to settle down. It's really important you take action now to make sure that everyone is as secure as they can be.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lisa. I think that encapsulates perfectly a lot of the things that we're seeing around that balance between productivity and security at this time with such large scale remote working. So that's really all we have time for now. I'm afraid that we are out of time. If we didn't get around to your question, absolutely, please use one of these options to sorry, that were on your screen, now back, to contact the Egress team. We'll also follow up with you, and Lisa is contactable via LinkedIn or via the Red Goat cybersecurity website as well. I know a few of you had a few more specific training questions just for Lisa, so I'm sure that she would love to follow up with you. I'm volunteering you there, Lisa. Brilliant. Well, thank you again, all of you, for your time. A recording of this session will be made available afterwards, and we'll send that to you using the details you registered with, so you can watch on demand if there were any bits that you'd like to view again, or you can share that with your colleagues internally. So thank you again, and we hope to see you again on a future webinar soon.